European colonizers didn't fear Africa's kings, they feared their wives. Meet the Dahomey Amazons, the only all-female army in history that left entire empires trembling.
If you love forgotten stories of powerful women, hit subscribe. I uncover a new one every week.
In 1890, a regiment of French soldiers marched into the kingdom of Dahomey, what is now the West African nation of Benin, fully expecting a quick, easy conquest. They had guns. They had numbers. They had the confidence of empire. What they did not expect was her. What they did not expect was an army of women who had spent decades training for exactly this moment. By the time the French understood what they were facing, it was already too late for hundreds of their men. This is the story of the Agoji, the women who became legends, the women the world tried to forget. The kingdom of Dahomey rose to power in the 17th century on the flat plateau of what is now southern Benin. It was a centralized, militarized monarchy, and from the very beginning, it understood something that the rest of the world would take centuries to even consider. Women could be soldiers. Not just soldiers. Elite warriors. The origins of the Agoji, pronounced Agoji, are debated by historians, but most accounts trace them to the reign of King Hugbadja, who ruled from around 1645 to 1685. According to oral tradition, the king organized a group of female elephant hunters called the Gbito. These women were fearless. They were skilled. And the king noticed. But it was under King Agaja, who reigned from 1708 to 1732, that the transformation became official. Agaja expanded a group of armed female palace guards into a functioning military unit. They were no longer hunters. They were soldiers of the state. Here is where history takes its first twist. These women were not volunteers in the way we might imagine. Many were recruited, sometimes forcibly, from among the king's wives, his servants, and women across the kingdom who showed physical aptitude. Once recruited, they took a vow of celibacy. They were sworn to the king, not as wives, but as warriors. They were considered ahosi, wives of the king, but their lives belonged to the battlefield. Their training was designed to extinguish fear. Recruits were made to crawl through thorny acacia thickets, without flinching. They hurled themselves off platforms. They were desensitized to the sight of death. One account from the 19th century describes Agoji recruits executing prisoners as part of their initiation. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was engineering. The kingdom was building something that the world had never seen, a standing army of women who felt nothing when facing death. Not even their own. By the 19th century, the Agoji had become the most formidable military force in the kingdom of Dahomey, arguably in all of West Africa. At their peak, under King Gizo, who ruled from 1818 to 1858, the Agoji numbered between 6,000 and 16,000 warriors. Some historians believe they made up nearly a third of the entire Dahomeyan army. Let that number sit for a moment. 6,000 women. Trained from adolescence. Armed with muskets, machetes, and clubs. Moving in coordinated formations under the command of their own female officers. King Gizo did not just use the Agoji, he elevated them. He gave them better rations than male soldiers. He gave them tobacco, alcohol, and slaves to attend to them. He built their reputation into the mythology of the kingdom itself. To face the Agoji was not just to face soldiers, it was to face the divine will of Dahomey. European visitors who witnessed Agoji military parades wrote accounts that dripped with shock and, in many cases, fear. One British officer described them as moving with, and this is a paraphrase, a ferocity that made his own soldiers uneasy. The Agoji were not just defensive warriors. They were the kingdom's primary raiding force. They launched night raids on neighboring kingdoms, particularly the Yoruba kingdoms to the north and east, capturing prisoners who were then sold into the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, this is the part of the story that complicates the legend. The Agoji were warriors of extraordinary skill and courage. They were also instruments of a kingdom that profited enormously from slavery. The prisoners they captured, men, women, children, were marched to the coast at Ouda and loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. History rarely gives us heroes without shadows. The Agoji are no exception. Among all the Agoji commanders, one name rises above the rest. Sejong Hongbe. In 1851, she led an Agoji force of 6,000 warriors against the Egba Yoruba stronghold of Abeokuta, a fortified city in what is now southwestern Nigeria. The Egba had walls. They had firearms supplied by British traders. They had male warriors trained and ready. The Agoji attacked anyway. What followed was one of the most documented military engagements in 19th century West African history, documented in part because a French naval officer named Frederick Forbes was present and sketched what he saw. The Agoji fought with devastating intensity, but Abeokuta held. The Dahomeyan forces, including the Agoji, were repelled. Here is the twist that most accounts leave out. Sedong Hongbe was not disgraced by this defeat. She returned to Dahomey and was received not with punishment, but with ceremony. Because in Dahomey, the standard was not just victory. It was that you fought as if dying meant nothing. And she had. Forbes' sketches of her remain some of the only contemporary images we have of an Agoji commander. She stands straight-backed, machete at her side. By the late 19th century, Europe had descended into what historians call the scramble for Africa, a race among colonial powers to carve up the continent. Dahomey was in the way. France had already established a protectorate over the coastal city of Cotonou. Dahomey's King Bahanzin, who came to power in 1889, refused to accept French sovereignty. He was proud. He was strategic. And he had the Agoji. In 1890, the First Franco-Dahomeyan War began. The French sent Colonel Alfred Amedee Dodds, a military officer of Senegalese and French descent, with a force equipped with artillery, rifles, and the full weight of French colonial machinery. What Dodds encountered at the Battle of Cotonou stopped his troops cold. The Agoji attacked at night. They moved in formations the French had no tactical training to counter. They breached the French perimeter not once but multiple times. French military dispatches from those days described the chaos of fighting an enemy that seemed, and these are the words of French officers, indifferent to death. One account describes an Agoji unit absorbing rifle fire at close range and continuing to advance. The French suffered significant casualties at Cotonou. Far more than expected. Far more than they would ever fully admit in public records.
They knew our plans.
Colonel
The forest
Dodds
ambush, sir.
He
Our
called
flank
for
is exposed.
reinforcements.
They fight like
and in
ghosts.
1892,
We are losing men.
France
We
launched
adapt,
a second,
or we are lost.
larger, more brutal campaign. The Second Franco-Dahomeyan War
trees!
was not a
Yes,
battle.
Commander!
It was a siege. A slow, grinding dismantling of everything Dahomey had built. France brought heavy artillery this time. They brought the Gatling gun. And they brought a strategy built on one simple truth, that no matter how fearless a soldier is, flesh cannot stop a cannon. The Agoji adapted. They abandoned open formations and shifted to guerrilla tactics, ambushes, night raids, flanking strikes from the forest. They inflicted casualties that French commanders privately found staggering. But the arithmetic of empire is merciless. At the Battle of Adigan in October 1892, a French force met a large Agoji contingent in open combat. The Agoji charged directly into artillery fire. French records acknowledge losing dozens of men in that single engagement. The Agoji lost hundreds. They charged anyway. By November 1892, French forces reached the capital, Dahomey. King Bahanzin, rather than surrender his palace, ordered it burned. The Kingdom of Dahomey, one of the most sophisticated military states in African history, was absorbed into French colonial territory. The Agoji were officially disbanded. After the fall of Dahomey, the surviving Agoji melted back into civilian life. Some were elderly, some were wounded, some carried children. They removed their uniforms. They put down their machetes. And the world, particularly the Western world, began the work of forgetting them. For nearly a century, the Agoji existed primarily in the oral histories of the Fon people. In French colonial records, they were often described in dismissive, dehumanizing terms. The idea of a professional, trained, elite all-female army did not fit the story Europe was telling itself about Africa. But here is the final twist. One of the last known surviving Agoji warriors, a woman named Nawi, was interviewed by a historian in 1978. She was, by some estimates, over 100 years old. She remembered the French. She said, and this has been passed down through oral record, that the French had not won. Not really. They had more guns. That was all. Nawi died in 1979. She was the last living link to the Agoji, to a military tradition that had lasted nearly 2.5 centuries. She was buried in Benin, the country that rose from the soil the Dahomeyans once defended. Today, the Agoji are remembered across the world, in museums, in academic texts, and yes, in film. The 2022 movie The Woman King brought their story to global audiences, though historians note it took significant creative liberties with the timeline and characters. But no film can fully contain what the Agoji actually were. They were not a myth. They were not an exception. They were a system, carefully designed, rigorously maintained, and lethally effective, that proved something the rest of the world is still catching up to. That the capacity for extraordinary courage is not determined by gender. It is determined by what you are willing to become. The Agoji are gone, but they never really left. History remembers the ones who refused to flinch.
If you love forgotten stories of powerful women, hit subscribe. I uncover a new one every week.